I wanted to make a few points about each paper, and then I'll go into a general summary of some of the issues of Asian hunter-gatherers. In the first paper, on wicker ornaments in far northern Asia, the point was made that this was an important element of material culture, is wicker. It certainly was evident in the presentation. This is northern Siberia, the 1st century BC up through the 17th century in the forest zone. And one of the things that's striking is the fact that there are containers, baskets, boxes. And these in geographic and anthropological terms have been described as facilities by Philip Wagner and others. And these are objects that contain or transform energy. Their organic material is rare in archaeological contexts, but in the cases where these are found, such as in burials and in well-preserved situations, you do get really fine preservation. And there are several things one notes about the material. The boxes made of wicker that have wicker inside them are found in a number of different contexts. The context of discovery is interesting. In North America context, if you find material somewhat similar to this in a burial context, you have to be very cautious about opening up the excavation. You have to call people in. You have to be very cognizant of indigenous perspectives on the excavation of these kinds of materials. It's valuable material, obviously. But one of the things it shows has to do with, in the Iron Age, trade relationships. And I think that's a critical feature of hunter-gatherers in Asia, is the trade, both trade between indigenous people or hunter-gatherers, trade with farmers, long-distance trade. This was true in a number of different papers here. Also, it's interesting to note the fact that you get differences in decoration, and there are a number of different interpretations of this kind of decoration. Some of this obviously could have been due to individual preferences. It also could have had to do with gender differences or, as mentioned, symbolic meaning or semantic meaning. Ian Hodder would look at this from his work in Africa and in the Middle East and would say that, well, this is stylistic. It may or may not represent function. Alan Osborne of the University of Nebraska, Omaha, would look at it differently and say, well, the variation in the decoration may reflect marriage relationships and people trying to differentiate items from one another. And you can see that with ceramics, you can see that with wicker. It's important to note, I think, that these geometric patterns on which are ornate on the objects are really sophisticated, but they may have multiple meanings, and I think that's something that came through in the presentation. The issue of functional or stylistic variation has been a live issue in anthropology and archaeology, certainly since the early part of the 20th century, but it really expanded in the 1960s. And in the 1970s and 1980s, gender dimensions began to be appreciated more and more. The Getty Conservation Institute, for example, in Los Angeles has done some studies of some of these kinds of wicker materials, and they've started to look at both the context in which they're found and the variation. And I think it's really useful to look at these wicker ornaments because they're very different, say, from what you'd see in Africa or in North America, North and South America. It's a really unique aspect of Asia. In the second paper by Mr. Ono, Dr. Ono, the technological and social interactions between indigenous and new migrants. This again is a critical area of concern in hunter-gatherer studies. The movement into New Guinea and Australia roughly 60,000 years ago, as you mentioned, was important for a variety of reasons, not least of which is the first maritime movement of Homo sapiens. Also important there is island adaptations, the island biogeography. There's been some discussion here initially in Brian Griffin's presentation about Homo floresiensis on the island of Flores in the Indonesian archipelago. All of these kinds of adaptations have impacts. Obviously, looking at coastal fishing, looking at shellfish collecting, and the site that was used in the discussion of in East Timor had lithics, had shell ornaments, fishing materials of a variety of kinds, and I found it interesting. This is some of the first evidence of tuna, and the question is this coming in lagoons? Is it pelagic or deep water species? If it was deep water species, does that imply canoe fishing? Certainly the trolling kinds of fish hooks that were made by using the various types of material, I think are indicative of at least some extent of extended fishing off the coast. The obsidian trade is very important. This is true in the Middle East, it's true especially in Asia, because you can get signatures out of this. So the Thalassia obsidian that was mentioned coming from the islands of New Britain, roughly 3,500 years ago, you can track this around the Southeast Asia, Oceania, Melanesia, Micronesia region. It's been very important. Getting a good signature is the hard part. And what's interesting is the extension into remote Oceania, into New Caledonia, Samoa, Tonga, places like that. This expansion does imply the movement of Neolithic migrants with farming, with domestic animals, with ceramics. The Pita people is a good example of Neolithic migrants in this. But the exchange between hunter-gatherers and farmers is really critical. Obsidian being one aspect of that, but also there was fish hook exchange. There are a number of other kinds of exchanges, and this is really obvious in the ceramics. And again, looking at the complexity of the ceramics with the dentate stamping is useful because you can begin to get an idea about why people might be differentiating ceramics that are located in the same domestic structure, for example. Fishing in coastal and reef areas is also very interesting. T. Stell Newman back in the 1960s and 70s talked about this on the Big Island of Hawaii, trying to differentiate the kinds of fishing strategies, how these might fit into hunter-gatherer fishing operations is really important. I think that's another aspect of Asian hunter-gatherers is the importance of fishing. And also, again, the shell adzes are really interesting. Shell adzes different, obviously, from adzes made of stone, but these do indicate various kinds of technological and social interactions between hunter-gatherers and farmers. In the third paper by Shinsuke Nakai and Kazunobu Ikeya on sedentarization and continued relationships between hunter-gatherers and neighboring farmers, looking at the Mlabri is interesting for a number of reasons. One, there's excellent opportunity here, as they've demonstrated with their work over the past 10 years, to look at the Mlabri people of Thailand and Laos. The advantages of their work are both that they are multidimensional in terms of types of methods they use, genetics, archaeological, ethnoarchaeological, ethnographic, and ethnohistoric. And you notice in the presentation some of the work of the 1930s, very fine work done on the Mlabri. And so you get pictorial representation and good data, number of people per camp, and that kind of thing. The second point is diachronic data, long-term information, and that's true throughout the Asian context, is you get very good diachronic data and good controls. The addition of linguistic evidence was obvious both in this case as well as some of the other cases, but when you start to combine archaeological, ethnographic, ethnohistoric, genetic, you can begin to look at long-term change and actually start to figure out the relationships between hunter-gatherers and other people. good example that was used in their presentation had to do with rattan, and that the Hmong offered honey and rattan in the Nun region in this area in the 1930s. And so living among the Hmong has been important, and some of those maps were beautiful in terms of representing the changes in residential location. And that adds the, raises the other question is how do you measure mobility? One way of doing it is looking at residential moves per annum or per season. Another way is looking at logistically how often you move out of a residential camp, go on short-term or even long-term collecting trips and that kind of thing, or even trading trips. So trying to dimensionalize residential moves, logistical moves, trading moves is a complex issue, but they've done a very nice job of showing the interaction between the Mlabri and others. In Kazanobu's presentation on beads, this is a very important presentation because if anything is characteristic of hunter-gatherers worldwide, it's the presence of beads. And particularly you see this obviously in Asia, you see it in North America, you see it in Africa. One of the things that's interesting is the diversity of beads in Asia that was demonstrated in Kazanobu's study. You're getting a mixture of plants, different kinds of materials, glass beads, later on iron beads, and that kind of thing. Africa is much less diverse in some ways. It does have shell beads from coasts, both in Morocco and in Blombas Cave and others in South Africa. But the range of diversity in types of beads is lower until you get later on in time, you begin to get glass beads, say, being traded in the Czech Republic or from Venice in the 14th century. You begin to see some changes in Africa, but Asia really stands out, I think, in the diversity of kinds of beads and the mixture, even on the individual women that he was showing among the Mani. You get a mixture of types of say, civet cat shell beads and plant remains. People don't always wear beads, but one of the issues that's been debated extensively in Kazanobu, and I think many of you are aware of this, is the whole question of costly signaling. What is the significance of wearing beads? Under what conditions do you do it? When do you do it? Some of the work, again, that's been done recently both in Africa and in the Great Plains of North America indicates that there's a big increase in the complexity of bead wearing during high-stress periods, such as extended droughts, mega droughts, those droughts lasting 10 or more years. And you see this across Asia, Africa, North America, South America, wherever you get really severe stress conditions, bead display, and to some extent bead exchange goes up, which is kind of goes against what you might say common sense, but it does make sense if you're trying to signal to other people, A, who you are, and B, what kinds of relationships you want to form with those other people, whether they're reciprocal relationships or short-term, long-term interactions such as Haro in the Kalahari. Kazanobu showed some pictures of that from the central Kalahari, which does have a Haro system. It's called Kai. That kind of system allowed people to move over larger areas because they had fictive kinship relationships with those people who they were exchanging beads with. A couple of things that's interesting, the Ainu beads with much more emphasis on glass beads. If you go to the Kalahari, you see something similar. Many of the beads that people are using today are a combination of Austrian shell beads that they make themselves, but also a lot of glass beads, very popular. And you see this throughout Africa, Asia, and North America. It's also interesting to note how they're passed down. They're passed down, as Kazanobu mentioned, matrilineally through the female line. And this is often true for materials. You see it in South China, and you see it in other parts of Asia, the matrilineal inheritance of beads. And also the progression from plants, animals, shell to glass of beads is very interesting. The long-term kind of diachronic significance of variability in beads, I think, is really useful. And clearly, people exchange beads, farmers and hunter-gatherers. Sometimes they were iron beads that they would get from farmers who had iron technology, and the presence of hunter-gatherers in Iron Age sites, for example, is often indicated by the presence of certain kinds of beads, ostrich eggshell beads being one example. So again, posse signaling, the social significance and variety of reasons for wearing beads and for making beads. And then finally, on the defensive residential complexes of North Asia, it's an amazing display of phenomenal, I guess you could call them, they're obviously complex sites. They have a number of implications, not just residential, but also for increases in conflict, defensive structures, the walls, the ditches that were made around these facilities. And I think it's significant that they appeared in the middle of the first millennium. They're clearly large-scale indicators of social, organizational, political change. It's also interesting that the conclusion that was drawn by the three authors of this paper was significant, and that is that the culture of farmers moving into the north saw them lose farming and return to foraging, but also adding to that a certain amount of conflict, interterritorial conflict, intergroup conflict, but the farmers essentially became foragers. And this is a general theme, I think, if you look at Asian hunter-gatherers, is this oscillation between foragers and farmers. It's not just a single unidirectional set of changes from foraging into farming, but some of the farmers who've been long established as farmers can return to being foragers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A lot of the useful comment too. It is very, a lot of the, if you time, more discussion about now.